Hello out there in comic book land. It's Wednesday morning, time for another edition of Ask Chuck Dixon, in which you ask me questions about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And if you want to ask a question, go to brunobookstore@gmail.com. Send your questions, comments, whatever. You just want to have a conversation. Contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. It's the most direct way to make sure I see your question. And the first question is from Thomas Arvenitis. I hope I'm not slaughtering that. What is your opinion about Jim Shooter as a writer and as an editor-in-chief? I know he is a controversial figure. Yeah, Shooter was he was a lightning rod. Apparently, kind of. I've heard good stories about Jim. I've heard bad stories about Jim. And I think anybody in a position of leadership, that's par for the course. And when you're the boss, there's people are going to like you, and there's people that aren't going to like you. My only encounter with him, I was working at Marvel at the very end of his aegis there. And the only time I saw him was he was out in the bullpen yelling at everybody about an issue of a comic that he felt was ugly. And he kept holding the comic up going, "This artwork is ugly. It's ugly." So I did not see him at his best. No. But, like I said, I've heard good stuff. I've heard bad stuff. But it's undeniable that under his editorship, Marvel was reborn, basically. Jim oversaw Marvel coming out of the doldrums of the 1970s. And the doldrums of the 1970s were deep. They were profound. Marvel comic sales were in the dumper. All comic sales were bad, but Marvel was, struggling to survive just as DC Comics was. And, Jim oversaw a period in which sales rose dramatically. And the company became highly profitable again. And also they began licensing things. There was licensing money coming in for the first time, to a great degree. And there were a lot of enormous outside deals made for licensed comics that turned out to be very profitable for Marvel. And he even tried to find new readers. Created a new line of comics called New Universe, which failed miserably, but I don't blame him for the effort. I appreciate it when anybody in charge in comics makes an effort to find new readership, and he did, but it didn't work out. Okay. Now, as I say, I didn't have a lot of contact with Shooter, even though I was doing quite a bit of work at Marvel in the last maybe 6 months of his editorship. Because I was in the Larry Hama corner of the building, literally in the corner. Larry had a corner office way in the back, in the dark. And it was the Larryverse. It was G.I. Joe, it was Conan, it was the Nom, it was all that stuff going on. And, Jim Shooter either didn't care about what Larry was doing or was wary of interfering with Larry. And I've heard a story about the latter that I'm not going to share here. But for whatever reason, Larry and Larry's, merry band, which included me at the time, we were left alone because we were irrelevant. We weren't part of the Marvel universe. So Shooter didn't care about us. But it's strange. I think the second time that Larry asked me to come up and have lunch, come up to Marvel and have a lunch meeting, was the day after Shooter was fired. And the lunch had been arranged a week before, and I didn't know I was going to be showing up on this historic day in comics. And I was invited out to this lunch, and it wasn't a business lunch. It was like a mass lunch. We took up the whole back room of this restaurant and put all these tables and chairs together, and people came from everywhere to basically see Jim Shooter off. And mostly these were people that didn't like Jim Shooter. And I was just along for lunch. I didn't feel one way or the other. But they had an empty chair at the end of the table, and there was much badinage about Shooter's reign at Marvel. And there was a lot of high-level talent. I mean, people came into the city from Connecticut and New Jersey. People came over from DC Comics who had formerly worked under Jim Shooter. So this lunch was enormous. So I got to meet all these people that I normally would not have met casually in under any other circumstance. Some big powerhouse names. And it was interesting. But overall, the most complaining I heard about Shooter was from other Marvel editors. And the thing about it is that all of these people complaining about Shooter had been given their jobs by Shooter. Apparently, they resented the fact that Jim gave them a job and expected them to do it. Now, he had some, like any editor-in-chief, he had a lot of directives. There were things about the Marvel Universe he didn't like, and so they were eliminated. Things like the Savage Land. Shooter didn't find it believable. Of course, most of the Marvel Universe is not believable, but that in particular he didn't find believable. And so as soon as he left, I put Timothy Truman and I put in a proposal for a Savage Land graphic novel because, Tom DeFalco, who took over, he was fine with the Savage Land. He was fine with turning the clock back on the Marvel Universe to the pre-Shooter era. But, like I said, when you're in a position of power like that, particularly in comics, where you've got a lot of people with self-esteem issues, you've got a lot of egos, you've got creative people, you've got some very sensitive people, and you've got to run this show. I heard he got a bit tyrannical at times, but like I said, I heard some stories of extraordinary generosity and kindness about Jim Shooter. So I can't have an opinion about him as a person because I never worked for him or under him. But I judge the guy by his actions, and his actions told me that he knew how to run a comic book company, and he proved it. He proved it wasn't a fluke because he went on over to started up Valiant Comics, and it was quite a success into the early 90s. Built this comic book company from the ground up, originally using characters from the old Gold Key comic line. Which brings me to Jim Shooter as a writer. I was never that aware of Shooter's writing when he was at DC or he was at Marvel. It didn't impress me all that much. I mean, it was competent. He was a good writer, but there wasn't anything special there for me. I think it was mostly the properties that he wrote. I didn't care about Legion of Superheroes at all. It didn't matter who was writing it. I just didn't care about it. But on Magnus Robot Fighter, which is a character I did like, I liked his writing. I followed this series for quite a while. I look forward to each monthly issue. And Valiant was kind of comics created the way he wanted to create them. They were very extraordinarily high quality on the art end, and the storytelling was it was compelling and it made sense. And there was a lot of care taken in the storytelling end at Valiant. They weren't, Marvel's a little bit messy, which is part of Marvel's charm. And it's almost as if Shooter got to recreate Marvel in his own image at Valiant. And I like the results. He very talented guy all the way around. And I like hearing his opinions even today. Even when I don't agree with them, his opinions are informed. And he's been there. He knows this business. He knows how it works. He knows how to make it work. So there you go. Another one from Thomas. Have you read any of the British football comics like Roy of the Rovers? What did you think of them? And what is your opinion of sports comics in general? Roy of the Rovers, it's one of the football comics, long-running football comics in the United Kingdom. And I've read some, but I couldn't get into it because, first of all, I don't care about soccer. And secondly, it was either the slang or the sports jargon. I didn't even know what they were saying half the time. So I was reading stuff in the 70s. Probably in the 70s. And the jargon was so dense, I didn't know what they were talking about. But it was extraordinarily popular in England. It ran for a long, long time. and in the weekly comic book, and there were other football and comics that were also popular. I can't remember any of them now, but I've sampled all of them because I love comics. I'll read a comic book. I'll give it a try, even if I'm not interested in the subject matter, just to see how the subject matter is handled. Because I love the medium and I love to see what people do with it, no matter what. Now, as far as sports comics go, England and Japan are the only countries I can think of that have regular sports comics. Japan's got a lot of sports comics about, baseball, basketball, golf, wrestling, all kinds of things. And, you got to wonder, well, why is sports comics a genre in the UK? And as far as I know, it might be in other European countries. I've simply never seen a sports comic from another European country. But I can imagine football comics would be a regular thing in Italy, Spain, Germany, everywhere the sport is popular, which is everywhere in Europe. But anyway, I mean, why do these sports comics succeed in the places they succeed and don't succeed in the United States? Now, sports comics have been tried here. I remember when I was a kid, this issue of Brave and Bold, Strange Sports Stories. I bought it because I liked Carmen Infantino's art, but I wasn't interested in strange sports. But of course, DC had to put their weird spin on it. And then again, I believe during the Shooter era it was, they did an NFL comic at Marvel, Super Pro, an NFL player turned superhero. And it's one of the many licensing deals that Marvel set up in the period. And well, this is issue 11. I'm surprised it went that far. Because there's a divide, there's a divide between people who are potential comic readers in the United States and people who are not comic book readers in the United States. And nerds don't like sports. And jocks don't like nerds or anything that nerds like. And this is endemic of what's wrong with American comics. What has been wrong with American comics since like the late 60s, which is that basically nerds took over the comic book industry. They turned comic books into a nerd medium because of the emphasis on superheroes and only superheroes. And that's kind of, I've explained this before in other videos. It's why we are where we are today with American comic books, and why our comics aren't like any other comics in the world, is because, number one, comic books early on were associated with children in this country, which they weren't in Europe and Asia and places like that. And then, there seems something that you outgrow. And so if you're leaning toward being a jock, you were leaning toward, growing up fast, growing up early, more emphasis on the opposite sex and their own physicality. You were going to outgrow comics earlier. And, the less athletically gifted amongst us were drawn toward the comic book, didn't outgrow it, or outgrew it later. Then many of them never outgrew it, and they became comic book editors. And then they drove the companies, and they drove the companies further and further from a general comic book audience. So that even if you had jock genetics, you weren't attracted to comic books, whereas, your dad probably read them, or your older brother probably read them. But you weren't attracted to them because there was nothing there for you anymore. There was no, He-Man cowboy westerns or war comics or anything like that. So I think that's why I say it's endemic. In these other countries, comics weren't necessarily seen as a childish medium. Adults regularly read comics, and they were seen as being about anything. And so, it's natural that a lot of people are interested in sports. There would be comic books aimed at sports people, and they didn't reject them because there wasn't this onus that comic books are only for nerds, and that jocks don't read comics. Overseas, jocks are just as likely to read comic books as anybody else, which is the way it used to be here, and it isn't anymore. And The nerds can only blame themselves. Myself, I've never been a sports guy. I didn't play competitive sports. I was asked to join a football team all the time because I'm big, 6'3", big guy, but I just had no interest. But unlike a lot of people who are nerdy and geeky, and I'll admit to being both, I don't hate sports. I'll watch a game now and again. If I get asked out to go to a football or hockey game or a baseball game, see it live, I'll go every time. I may not know anything about the players, but it's a great experience. And I like reading about sports because sports writing is a lot like comic book writing. There's a lot of hyperbole. It's written very broadly, and it's about power and struggle and conflict, just the way most comic books are. So I enjoy reading about sports. I enjoy a good sports movie. There's nothing better than a good boxing movie or a good movie about baseball. So I'm not down on sports. It's just not a thing that I do. And of course, I could never write a sports comic book because I'm just not conversant enough. I wouldn't have anything clever or interesting to say on the subject. But I think it's a pity that there aren't sports comic books here. I think marketed correctly, outside of the comic book market, outside of the direct market, you could probably sell a sports comic here in the United States. If you got the kids early enough. I imagine a sports comic aimed at 10 to 13-year-olds, you could probably get somewhere if you did it right. Anyway, that's all I can think of to say on sports comics. Eric Morin, will we ever see any of your novels as comic books? I would love to see what Gary Klappas or Graham Nolan could do with the material. Thanks for taking the time and effort to do Ask Chuck Dixon. It's always an enjoyable listen. Well, thank you for listening. In addition to writing comics, I've written a number of novels, 26 or 27, maybe 28 novels. I had a Bad Time series. It's a time travel, military accented time travel series. And I have my Levon's Cade series, which is about it's crime, vigilante justice kind of thing. Ongoing retribution, lots of shooting and killing and cussing, all the rest of it. The reason why I started writing novels is because I wasn't getting enough comic work. And this way I could write without having to hire an artist or find an artist or rely on an artist or wait for an artist. I could just write and tell a story. And obviously it's cheaper to do prose because it's just words. Comics are expensive to produce. The other reason why I probably wouldn't, I'm not anxious to or looking to adapt my novels into comics is because there's a much larger audience for prose books than there are for comic books. I would be, selling down to a smaller market. And, I am a professional writer, and it is a business. As much as I love comics, I've got to spend my time profitably. Now, of all the books I've written, the one I probably would most want to turn into a comic is Blooded. It's a vampire novel set present day, and it's it would be a one and done, like 6-issue miniseries kind of thing. And because it's a singular novel, there's no sequels. It's not the beginning of a series. And I think with the right artist, it would be a very interesting comic book or graphic novel. But no firm or even serious plans to turn my prose into comics. KP, in your Punisher Warzone comics, you introduced Thorne, who was one of the Carbones before quote-unquote dying. Is Thorne your spin on the horror slasher? He feels like a wise guy, amnesiac Jason Voorhees. He also did Punisher Batman Scratch and Itch you couldn't with Batman Dirty Harry. In the opening arc of Punisher Warzone, Frank Castle goes undercover with the Carbone family, a mafia family. He's looking to destroy the family from within. He runs into Sal Carbone, who's kind of the Fredo of the family, and he believes he's killed him. But Sal survives, but he can't remember who he is. He takes on the name Thorne, and he believes that he cannot be killed because he survived Frank Castle's attack, he feels now that he cannot be killed. And I kind of leave it up in the air whether or not that's true, whether or not something's happened. And I see on a number of websites where some comic fans have reasoned out how he could actually be a mutant or actually have taken on either supernatural or meta-human abilities, so that he is a bit of a challenge. Now, I didn't create him after Jason Voorhees, who, like Michael Myers, is a character who simply can't be killed, never dies, always returns, no matter what happens to him at the end of every movie. I didn't create him with that model in mind. He was mostly created because of the idea that the Punisher, his whole raison d'etre is to kill his enemies. Unlike most comic book superheroes who are fine with sending the villain to jail or the Phantom Zone, or leaving them stranded on an iceberg, the Punisher wants to see his enemies dead. And so I needed to create a guy who wouldn't die. Because Punisher villains, name 5 Punisher villains. I can't even name 5 Punisher villains. I mean, after Jigsaw, I can't think of anybody because they always get killed. And Jigsaw was another one. His gag was that he always came back, and more scarred than he was before from his last encounter with Frank. And so I just wanted to come up with a character who was really hard, really hard to kill. And obviously crazier than Frank, nuttier than Frank, even more violent than Frank. And so, that's why Thorne was created, as a villain that could actually be recurring in the Punisher universe. As far as Batman Dirty Harry, the Batman Punisher thing, that was, wow, I wanted to do that. I campaigned for it for 2 years, trying to put that deal together, and it wasn't until Nightfall, and the popularity of Nightfall, that Marvel took notice and took it seriously. And I think Denny O'Neil pretty much put the deal together with Don Daly at Marvel, with Tom DeFalco's blessing. Don Daly had been assistant editor under Denny in the past, and I think they liked working together. And my version, there were 2 different ones, 2 different editions of Batman Punisher being created simultaneously. One with the pretender to the throne, Asbats, and one with Bruce Wayne, Batman. And I got to write the Bruce Wayne Batman one, and Archie Goodwin was editor on that one. So it was really cool. It was so much fun to write that crossover because I love both characters so much, and I was conversant with them. I was writing both of them simultaneously at the time, so I was kind of the natural pick. Now, I'm still disappointed I didn't get to write Batman Dirty Harry, which, if you watched the previous video, you know that I proposed a Batman Dirty Harry crossover, both properties being owned by Warner's. It seemed like a no-brainer to me, and it rolled along, and everybody was very enthusiastic all the way around until it got to Clint Eastwood, who nixed it because he didn't want to be portrayed in a comic book in any way, shape, or form. I don't know if he doesn't like comic books, or he's afraid he wouldn't be portrayed properly, or he didn't want to let those crazy comic book people loose on his property, or just thought the whole idea was silly. I don't know. But, Clint is Clint. I bowed to his judgment, but it hurt, man, because I had a whole story where Harry comes to Gotham and does not see eye to eye with Batman on any issue. But Harry's there to bring back a criminal wanted. He's being extradited to California, and Harry's there to escort him back, and of course the guy escapes, and Harry's on the hunt through the Gotham underworld with Batman on his heels, because Batman does not, he doesn't want to see all of his rogues gallery gunned down with a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world at the time. So yeah, that's still an itch I'd like to scratch. Eric Valencia. Have you ever used inspiration from one of your old stories for a current project? Like Clint Eastwood did with Shane for Pale Rider, but using your own old ideas for new books. So Clint comes back into the picture again. No, I don't like reusing stuff. I don't the whole idea is you don't want. I mean, Larry Hama told me once that he was careful never to reuse the same phrasing in a narration caption. I mean, that's how far he went toward not repeating the same ideas over and over again. So yeah, I wasn't anxious to do that at all. Although I never let an idea go to waste. So if I do think of something and I don't end up writing it, if I pitch something or write an outline or whatever, and I don't get to use it, I'll find another place for it. Like when I wrote a treatment for Expendables 2, which was never used and never paid for, so it still belonged to me, and I repurposed it for an arc in G.I. Joe. I think Will Rosato did the artwork. But I repurposed not the entire plot line, but a lot of the elements, and particularly the action set pieces, because I loved the set pieces I came up with, and I didn't want them to go to waste. So never waste a good shootout. Now, as far as inspiration from other people's works, the most direct example I can think of is when I was on Savage Sword of Conan, I read a lot of Uncle Scrooge comics because Carl Barks, his Uncle Scrooge stories are adventure stories first and foremost. I mean, they're funny, engaging, and charming, but the plot lines are straight up adventure stories, dramatic adventure stories, with Uncle Scrooge and Donald and Huey, Dewey, and Louie hunting, through strange lands and exploring jungles and extinct volcanoes and finding lost civilizations. I mean, it's all Conan stuff. So I didn't really lift any plot lines from Carl Barks. I didn't take plot lines from Carl Barks, but I looked at the way he would structure these stories and studied how he structured them and used a lot of that in Savage Sword of Conan. Because remember, Savage Sword of Conan was a 50-page story done in one. So you had to have all the pieces of a good story there. Pacing, plotting, beginning, middle, end, satisfying conclusion, interesting opening, all the rest of it. And Barks's stories, his longer stories, pretty much they didn't run for 50 pages, but it was 50 pages worth of story because of the number of panels on the page. So it just seemed like a great idea to look at what Barks did in order to write these Conan stories. Because I was already conversant with Howard. I understood Howard and everything else. Reading Robert E. Howard wasn't going to help me any. Or rereading Howard again wasn't going to help because it was all in there. I had all that data. I just needed, because remember, I'm just starting out in comics at this point, full time. And I just needed some guidelines, and who better than Carl Barks, the man who invented comic book writing. Now, I can't go away without saying that, I don't know why, of all the Westerns Clint Eastwood could have made, I love Clint Eastwood Westerns. This is my least favorite. Pale Rider is my least favorite. Why would you go back to an absolute indelible classic like Shane and think you could remake it better? I mean, Shane is a flawless, seamless Western action story full of heart and emotion and catharsis, and it's a great movie from beginning to end. And Pale Rider is not. It's just not up to the par of Shane. Alan Ladd's Shane is he's obviously a cold, miserable killer from his past, but in his present he doesn't act that way. He's charming and sensitive. He's a good guy at heart. He's just a hard man who's had a hard life, but he still knows the difference between right and wrong. And Clint Eastwood plays a kind of a Avenger character. It's close to his High Plains Drifter character, where he's enigmatic and somewhat distant. It's a weird movie. It's a weird movie. I mean, I've watched it a few times. I just don't love it like I love Outlaw Josie Wales or Spaghetti Westerns or High Plains Drifter or Unforgiven. Or I like Joe Kidd better than I like this movie. But that's just me. But big Clint Eastwood fan all around, obviously. Damian Field. I was wondering how you balanced the through lines of your writing when a character of extremely different aspect was included. As an example, the mythological aspects for an appearance by Wonder Woman, or alternatively very science fiction focused Superman, Legion of Superheroes in the noirish detective stories of a street-level crime-fighting character like Batman. Yeah, I mean, DC in particular has this problem. Marvel, not so much. Marvel has found a way, you know, they don't have a Batman. Marvel really doesn't have a Batman. All their characters are somewhat fantastical. You know, they're all mega powered. And, you know, even Spider-Man, their humblest creation, is, you know, he's an awesome figure. He's a warrior. DCU, their two most popular characters couldn't be more different. You've got Batman, a self-made man. Everything about Batman is cool. He had to create himself. Superman was literally dropped on a planet where he's a planet that gives him godlike powers. He wasn't even born to it. He lucked into it. His parents fired him off in his rocket. He landed on a planet where not only he would survive, but he would be like the supreme being on the planet. You know, and thank God he's a good guy. Otherwise, he'd have to rule the world, right? Instead of, you know, saving kittens from trees. So, so you have these two completely disparate characters, and DC's always had this schism of how to deal with them. Do you bring them together? Do you keep them apart? They exist in the same universe, but they sometimes don't. And, you know, this is tough because Batman's supposed to be grounded in reality. And whenever you take Batman out of his reality, Batman is a weaker character. When I was a kid, you know, this is where Batman was. Really silly science fiction-y type stories because that's what was selling at the time. You know, big monsters, science fiction, robots. Those were the comics that were selling. And so, you know, Batman would encounter these in order to try to stay relevant. And as a kid, I had no interest in these comics. I didn't want to read them. I thought they were silly. But I did love Batman, so I would read the reprint 80-page giants, which I just loved. I would read the covers off of them because it was like, well, this is the way Batman is supposed to be. And but you know, DC's always had a problem. You know, Brave and Bold was pretty much the place where the Batman could mix with the rest of the DCU, and you know, it was a popular title. People liked this, you know, these kind of stories, seeing Batman react to other characters in the DC universe, and you know, kind of you know, he would either be at odds with the team up character, or it was kind of an odd couple situation. But they were often detective stories because that's, you know, when you're dealing with characters with superpowers, Batman's superpower is his intellect. So the writers wisely wrote a lot of these as mystery stories because obviously Batman isn't going to be able to, you know, move things telepathically with his mind, or travel through time, or, you know, move planets out of their orbits, or redirect rivers. He's not that kind of character. But he would use his intellect. And the Brave and Bold run, that's pretty much, you know, what that was all about. But again, DC's faced with this dichotomy of all these superpowered characters on one side, Superman being the biggest, and then their other biggest character being Batman. Now, when I worked in the Batman offices, Denny O'Neil was the group editor, and he very much did not want Batman mixing with the rest of the DCU. And I thought sometimes it was a mistake. I mean, in instances like Cataclysm and No Man's Land, we don't ever see the Justice League show up. And, you know, a lot of fans were not happy with that because he does still exist. And I would talk to Denny about ways to at least address the issue. I mean, just give us a few panels, give us a page, you know, give us a reason why the rest of the heroes in the DCU are not showing up in Gotham. And, you know, on the flip side, why some of the more powerful villains weren't showing up in a lawless Gotham like post-Cataclysm and No Man's Land. But, you know, Denny, you know, like I said earlier, you know, about Jim Shooter, Denny was in charge. He had his own ideas. He hired me. So I would talk to him about it. We would have discussions about it. But in the end, his word was law. And we didn't do it because he didn't like it. As I said in previous videos, he didn't like the villains that were science fiction-y in Batman. He didn't like Mr. Freeze. He didn't like Clayface. He didn't like Man-Bat. He thought they were villains that belonged with some other character, but not Batman. Now, for my own sins, when I was brought back to write, well, actually, when I was on Punisher, I just dream of Punisher in a fight with Ulick the Troll. Ulick the Troll over from Thor comics. And I just couldn't get out of my head this idea of what would Frank Castle do against, you know, a a troll out of Viking legend. You know, and Ulick's, badass character. What would that fight be like? And I always wanted to do it, but Don Daly, as willing as he was to experiment with almost anything, would not let me write that story. He just thought it was too crazy. When I was invited back to Marvel to do Marvel Knights, they basically, Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, much to their dismay, gave me carte blanche on the title, and I worked in my Ulick the Troll Punisher fight. And I was so happy with it. And Joe and Jimmy were appalled. And I got a phone call from Jimmy. It was like, what the hell are you doing? What's with the troll? We wanted a street level gritty book. And I'm like, no, this may be my last shot at writing the Punisher, which it was, and I'm not going to miss it. I'm my last hurrah is Frank Castle fighting a troll. And Jimmy and Joe were like, okay, they went along with it. I think readers liked it. I got a lot of reaction out of that. And Eduardo Barreto and Klaus Janson did the scene, and it's a ball buster. It's a hell of a fight. Frank doesn't win, by the way. But I got that out of my system, speaking of itches that needed to be scratched. Okay, James F1. I'm not sure if F1 was part of your name or a remnant from when I transferred your name over to my Word file. The Batman animated series was gaining popularity just as you were becoming the top guy for the Bat Family books. Did you ever watch it? If so, what was your opinion? Currently rereading all your stuff from the 90s and loving it. Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. I mean, just as I started writing Batman comics, the TV show came on, and I never missed an episode. My kids were a little too young at that point to enjoy it, but they caught up with it years later. And it was such an awesome show. And the greatest thing about it was, this was the first animated drama that had ever been done. They didn't use cartoon voice actors. They used real actors. I mean, real, name television and movie actors that we knew. Incredible voice cast on this show. And they treated everything dramatically. It wasn't treated like your standard cartoon, with people with squeaky voices or weird, exaggerated voices. It was very much a drama, which made it different, and I think made it more popular. It was very wise of the guys heading this up, chiefly Bruce Timm and Paul Dini, to stay with a dramatic take on the characters. It's also a very loyal, accurate take on the Batman universe. These guys literally did their homework. I ran into Paul Dini and Bruce Timm a number of times at DC because they would come and visit the offices in New York. And one time I had to go down to the DC library, which Peter Sanderson ran, and it was a room in the DC offices, a big room, where every comic they had ever published was there, available in hardbound editions. And you could go back and read any comic. And I go there, and Paul Dini's sitting at a table with stacks of volumes, going through them, studying Batman. And, us guys in comics, the guys working on the titles at the time, the editors and writers, and we really appreciated that level of earnestness, that level of dedication, that idea of getting it right. And they did. They got it right. I think the Batman animated series is more loyal to the property than anything else. It's much closer to the comics than the movies. And they came up with a lot of interesting characters on their own. And there was a lot of crossover. There's a lot of crossover creator stuff going on between the guys, myself and the other writers and editors, with the guys in Burbank. So there was a lot of back and forth, and they would share a lot of information with us. So it was cool. It was a cool time. I hate the word synergy, but there was synergy. We were both gearing up simultaneously. In the comics end, we were doing Nightfall, gearing up toward Nightfall, and on the animated end, they were putting on this marvelous show, and it all just came together and made the property, new and fresh for a whole new audience, and that was cool. And of course, the best version of Bane ever is the animated Bane, voiced by Henry Silva. And that was a thrill. That was my first experience with seeing something of mine outside of comics, and that was pretty cool. And they were very, like I said, very, very loyal to sticking with the continuity that the comic books had established, using the comic books as source material and only the comic books, and expanding on it. But it was a very neat experience. Mr. Entertainment, are you a fan of Frank Robbins' scripts on Batman, along with his collaborators Bob Brown, inked by either Joe Giello or Dick Giordano? I think he's an underrated talent that brought Batman back to his dark roots with O'Neill. His art sucks, though. Okay. Frank Robbins was a comic strip guy, primarily, and he did a comic strip. I'll get into the comic strip in a minute. But as the adventure comic strips began to wane in the newspapers and directly affected Frank Robbins' income, he turned to comic books, and he did some work on the Shadow, and he created Man-Bat at Batman. He wrote some terrific Batman stories, and his writing on Batman precedes Denny's, and when Denny comes along and sort of takes Batman closer back to his own roots, makes him darker and everything else, Robbins went right along with it. If anything, I think Frank Robbins' stories post Denny are darker than Denny's stories. In a Frank Robbins story, Frank Robbins was more about urban crime. His stories were grimmer. I hate the word gritty, but they were grittier. They were more street. So street, in fact, that I think the only time in DC Comics history the N-word appears in a Batman story written by Frank Robbins. A story about racial tensions in a prison. And, his writing was marvelous. And he doesn't get all the credit he deserves because he was right there with Denny O'Neill, taking Batman back to his roots, restoring Batman's legacy, that had been absent for a long time due to silliness at DC and the 1966 television show. O'Neill and Robbins both returned Batman to what he was. Now, Robbins went on to do long runs at Marvel on various titles, Man from Atlantis, Captain America, The Human Fly, things like that. And fans never took to him because comic fans' only exposure to him was the comic books that he drew. But I gotta stand up for Frank Robbins because he did a long-running comic strip called Johnny Hazard. And it was an aviation strip about Johnny Hazard. He's a freelance pilot getting into trouble all over the world. And it was a daily and Sunday strip that ran for over 30 years. And Robbins did all the work, the writing and the artwork. It was all him for 30 years, one-man shop. And the strip is amazing. It's one of my favorite comic book strips. It's smartly written. It's beautifully paced. It's got indelible characters. I mean, I really dig it. I've got an almost complete collection of the Sunday strips. I've got a lot of years of the daily strips. And the guy was a master at, pacing out a story, getting characters, creating characters and getting them up and running, creating involving and engaging mystery stories. I can imagine reading these as dailies and Sundays. You couldn't wait to see what happened the next day because he would set up these terrific suspense situations. And, it was sometimes a crime strip, sometimes an adventure strip. There was a lot of humor in it, and a massive number of ensemble characters, because Johnny Hazard would move from place to place. He was a freelance aviator, and each story would be populated with brand new characters. And as the new adventure would begin, a whole new cast of characters would be introduced. He must have created thousands of unique characters over the run of this comic strip. And I really enjoy it. And he is a hell of an artist. Now, comic fans don't like him because he's not a superhero guy. I think he did the superhero stuff because there was a paycheck involved. He was a good artist. He was capable. But like Don Heck, his strong suit was not superheroes. He drew in a far more impressionistic style than comic book readers generally appreciate. They want more detailed artwork. They want things clearer. They don't look at storytelling. I hazard the guess, play on words. I hazard the guess that, you could read a Frank Robbins story not liking the artwork, but be engaged anyway, because the storytelling's so damn good. But, I can see why comic fans didn't take to it. They didn't know the history. They didn't know how good this guy was. Now I mentioned it impressionistic, and if you look at some of these panels, you can see what I mean. Nick Cuddy, great comic book writer, told me a story about when he was an assistant to Wally Wood, and Wally Wood needed to draw the interior of a helicopter. He needed to draw the control console of a helicopter, and could find no reference. And Wally was big on reference. He was big on tracing. He was big on using photos whenever he could, and he had a huge morgue of visual reference, but could not find an interior shot of a helicopter. So he said to Nick Cuddy, here's a stack of old Johnny Hazard dailies, and I want you to go through them, because Robbins drew helicopters all the time. There's got to be a usable helicopter interior here that we can copy, we can swipe. And Nick says, okay. So Nick tells him he spends hours going through these Johnny Hazard strips, and then finally he finds one. And remember, these were clipped out of the newspaper. So it's this little panel with a helicopter thing on it, helicopter interior. And he takes it to the Xerox machine and he blows it up so that Wally can trace it. He blows it up. He's shocked, and he takes it to Wally and he goes, I found you a helicopter interior. Robbins did one, but look at it. And Wally looks at this blow up of this interior of this helicopter and says, what is this? It just looks like noodles. It just looks like a mess. What is this? He goes, it's Robbins's helicopter interior blown up. And then he shows Wally the original strip, and damn, it looks like a convincing drawing, of a helicopter interior. But when you blew it up, there's nothing there. Robbins was drawing for reduction, and he knew, what he could add and what he could leave out, and it still looked utterly convincing and authoritative as a helicopter console of a Sikorsky or a Pisaki helicopter. And Nick said that Wood was like, well, I can't use this. There's nothing here. So that's an example of how impressionistic his work was, and maybe why comic fans weren't that into it. But I dig it the most, and I know a lot of artists who are big Frank Robbins fanciers, who have collections, stacks of his original dailies and Sundays that they look at all the time, and with tremendous admiration. So there you go. I had to stand up for Frank Robbins. Arkhaven, Arctoons. Have you checked it out? Why haven't you checked it out? Go check it out. It's at arkhaven.com. It's a new digital comics platform. Maybe by the time you see this video, there'll be a phone app. You can read it on your phone. Otherwise, you can read it on your laptop, your tablet. You can read it in your living room. You can read it on whatever device you're looking at this video on. You can read Arctoons. And it's dozens and dozens and dozens of properties, new episodes every week. Tens and tens of thousands of people are checking this out. It's free. It's high res. Please go over and take a look. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Thanks for the likes. Thanks for the support. Thanks for the subscribing. All I ask is continue to spread the word, because I want to keep doing these. I want to have a reason to do them. But you've all been great, and I appreciate every single one of you, and I will see you all down the road.